Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session, building the agile retrospective effectiveness scale. Very excited to have you here. This is a session that's going to talk a lot about how we created this instrument, which we're really excited about. We think this could make a big difference to all companies and organizations interested in really truly embracing a data-driven approach to continuous improvement. Just a quick note about myself. My name is Jorgen Hesselberg. I'm the co-founder of Comparative Agility, and I'm very fortunate to be presenting together with you, and that's Nikki Kohari.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. We're so thankful to have you here. I'm Nikki Kohari, the COO here at Retrium, and we're a product that helps teams facilitate engaging retrospectives that build trust and psychological safety, cultivate learning, and fuel continuous improvement. And I'm a certified professional coach, a scrum master, a mindfulness meditation facilitator, and I've been a leader in agile organizations for over a decade now. So along with the team at Comparative Agility and with feedback from the retrospective community, I use my background in organizational psychology, team and executive coaching, as well as Agile, of course, to build the Agile Retrospective Effectiveness Scale, which we call ARES for short. And we're so excited to take you on an in-depth journey of how we built the assessment and where we go from here. And so today, we're going to talk about four things. We are going to, if we could have the next slide, we are going to talk about why we wanted to measure effective retrospectives, how the ARES was constructed, piloted, and refined, what we plan to do with it going forward, which there's a lot of excitement around that as well, and then who can benefit from taking the assessment, which, spoiler alert, might be you and your organization. So we're really excited to tell you more about it. I mentioned earlier that I'm an executive and team coach, and I wanted to mention that because an experience that I had in that community really led to the inspiration for what we're doing with the ARES here. You know, I spent a lot of my personal free time just trying to up-level my coaching skills, and I always enjoy learning from industry experts. I'm sure you all do as well. And a while ago, I happened to be listening to something about a presentation about leadership coaching, where we were talking about how we enable clients by creating greater awareness that integrates somatic and cognitive and emotional dimensions. And I thought that was really interesting. And the presenter happened to be an author, a coach, a clinical psychologist, interestingly enough, and also a Harvard professor. So kind of an interesting background to talk about coaching. And he was describing an issue that his clients had. And to make a sort of a long story short around that, the team decided to take Amy Edmondson's psychological safety measure because they were having some potential issues there. They wanted to really understand what was going on. And they had some low scores. And they were trying to figure out, okay, what do we do next with this information? And so the team got together and they discussed the best way to create some psychological safety on the team. And they, creating psychological safety is really hard because it's an individual perception. So it's not something you're going to artificially generate. It's not something that's going to develop overnight. And so ultimately, this team decided that they needed a weekly meeting where they could talk about what's going well, what's not going well, and creating some equal time and conversation and energy around all of those things. And of course, having that scheduled formal outlet was really important to them because they needed to create this safe space to have the conversations that were just not happening otherwise on this particular team. That's probably going to sound very familiar to us in the Agile community, this opportunity for reflection, connection, and clarity. That's really a retrospective. But this team, that was an aha moment. They came to this conclusion of essentially having a retrospective without knowing anything about really Agile or retrospectives. So that's really interesting. And just to give some context here, while the research in organizational psychology and specifically voice, it's going to talk about the relationship between psychological safety and how people tend to speak up or actually don't speak up. Most of the time, people are going to default to silence. And so it's not really surprising that this particular team is not feeling comfortable together and they're not having those important conversations. And we actually see the research on conflict as well, and particularly this idea of productive conflict. It shows us the same thing, that people are often conditioned in early childhood with different messages of, hey, stay out of it. Or if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. So you may have had those messages and have heard those things before. And so it's no wonder that people are defaulting to silence when they're not feeling safe speaking up, or they just, naturally fall into that tendency. And so when teams do naturally fall into that tendency, it's going to pull them away from those important conversations. And unless they have an explicit place, unless they're putting explicit effort into combating that. And so teams need this place to dig in, to work together, to talk about difficult topics, and to decide what to do next. And that is a retrospective. And so to kind of put a bow on what they talked about and what the presentation was about that I mentioned earlier, the team actually saw huge gains when they started having these weekly meetings. They saw improvements in their ability to collaborate and to just get things done with their version of a retrospective. And that's really interesting. This, unlike this conference, which is for folks in the Agile community, other people on the call that about this leadership presentation, they were not Agilists. They were not people who understood retrospectives, and neither was this team. And yet we were all sort of coming to the same conclusion that one way to create great teamwork is through a retrospective. And that's probably why most of us in the Agile community have bought into the idea of doing them on a regular basis. If you look at the State of Agile survey and the report that goes along with that, retrospectives are currently the second most popular Agile ceremony that teams do, and they've been gaining in usage ever since. I think that's over 80% of teams are doing them, and hopefully more teams will be doing them as the years go on, because they are so powerful. And I've had, hundreds, if not thousands, of conversations with customers and folks that are just running retrospectives, in particular during my time here at Retrium, but certainly before we were talking about retrospectives in my career as well. And it's clear to me that when retrospectives are done well, they're very powerful. When they're effective, they can build relationships, they can build trust and safety, like we saw in this particular example with this team. But I've also heard messages like they enable unique insights that would have never been possible under other conditions. They create common mental models and frameworks that help teams work together towards common objectives. And they help teams just get better and drive innovation and continuous improvement. And they're really this sort of hidden catalyst, something we don't necessarily talk about, for team and organizational change. So we want all of that goodness. We want to make sure that people are having retrospectives that are as effective as possible. So that's kind of one side of things. But then I also hear conflicting messages from the community, and particularly with Agile coaches in my network, that there's a sense that many people are having retrospectives, but they're weak, hence the name of the presentation today. And they're just not feeling that they're as effective as they could be. And yes, doing retrospectives is necessary, but it's not sufficient for change. And so we really need to up-level the retrospectives that the whole community is having. And that's one of the reasons why we're moving forward today. So this led me to wonder, of course, when I get these crazy ideas, it leads me to wonder a couple of things. If you want to go to the next slide for me, what is an effective retrospective anyway? That's interesting. We see them happen all the time, but what does effectiveness really mean? And if we could figure out what an effective retrospective is, can we actually quantify that? Can we make it something that will help people when they get that particular insight that helps them and their teams continuously improve? And, okay, if we can do that, can we then take it forward and look at the relationship between retrospectives and business outcomes that people care about, whether it's leaders or executives or just employees in general, because we're hearing those stories all the time here at Retrium, but they're just one-off stories here and there. We're not really looking at them in any measurable way. So we really want to dig into that. And so that leads me to, okay, when I look at these big questions, let me look at the literature and figure out what does the community say about it and what information is out there. So if you want to advance to the next slide for me, we talk about what's available to the community when we think about the relationship between retrospectives and business outcomes or retrospective effectiveness. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of content around how to do a retrospective, and there are a lot of stories around their impact out there, but there's not as much clarity around what makes an effective retrospective, and there are actually very few measurable findings on their impact. So we wanted to make some changes there. So early research, though it's sporadic, it does support a positive relationship between retrospectives and team and organizational success, which is great because I have conversations with executives all the time who are looking to implement retrospectives, not just in their development teams, but across their organization. And so having those conversations really helps them understand what the potential business impact is when they bring retrospectives into their whole organization. According to an independent study done by Larry Maccheroni, who actually was one of my former colleagues when I worked at Rally Software long ago, he was actually working on his PhD at Carnegie Mellon and did a research project with using some data from the organizations that were using Rally Software at the time. And what was interesting is that he found consistent retrospectives. So those teams that did retrospectives at least once a month, if not more often, that was related to better performance. So that was really cool to see that potential impact of retrospectives. And there's also similar research in organizational psychology that shows the relationships between reflection opportunities, it's kind of like a retrospective, and measures of team success, including the paper here that I reference around guided team self-correction. And they found when the teams debriefed their experiences together using a facilitated approach, they had a more accurate understanding of their team dynamics. It demonstrated more team effectiveness processes, and they just performed better in the training exercises that were part of this experiment. So it's not exactly the same as what we're seeing with retrospectives. These are sort of military-oriented experiment as opposed to just out in the workplace. But there are definitely parallels in the potential impact when we give teams reflection opportunities about the changes in mindset and the performance that it can create. So that's really interesting. And this, of course, also led me to look out in the community for other potential results, and happened to connect with Jorgen and the team at Comparative Agility. And he also had some interesting research that we wanted to share with you all today. So I'll hand it back over to him.
Thank you, Nikki. And let's do the next slide, because this is really interesting. There might not be a lot of causal relationships when it comes to this. It's hard to make that causal connection, but there's certainly correlations. And I think there is something to be said around clues. If you look at patterns, if you look at how certain companies, people, leaders do certain things, there are certain patterns that keep happening. And I think there are clues there that we can take up on and we can learn from. So that was kind of the challenge we gave to our data scientists. Comparative agility, we like to call ourselves the Spotify of continuous improvement. What we do is we capture lots of validated survey results from domain experts. So we have lots of data now across 14,000 different organizations in 84 different countries, more than 4 million data points, lots of data. But what we were trying to do was to say, if you look at things like retrospectives, what are some of the things that really stand out? So what we did is we started off saying, with all those companies, 14,000 companies, let's try to limit just the best performing companies that we have in our index. And the way we did that was simply to look at public records. We looked at companies that were on the public exchanges, and we looked at things like EPS growth, earning per share growth, which is a common established metric for terms of performance. And we look at market share growth. Those are things that are very objective and very hard to argue that those are bad things. If you do that consistently over the course of 5 years, which is what we looked at here, that is a very positive indicator that you're doing something right. So in our index of more than 14,000 companies, we looked at the companies that have the best indications of those very objective measures. And we limited down to about 15 companies that did really well over 5 years in those particular elements and metrics. Okay, so now we have the best performing companies. Then we looked at the best performing teams, the highest performing teams inside of those best performing companies. So now you're thinking really the best of the best here. And then we're looking at those teams and seeing the patterns that they were exhibiting through their surveys. And then we started to say, okay, what are the things that these really great teams are doing that are correlated to positive outcomes as they report it themselves. So we have proxy variables, which is essentially the team's perception of how they're doing in three really, really key areas. One is speed to market, the other is quality, and the third was customer satisfaction. These are sort of universal in terms of what we are trying to accomplish. So we said, all right, great. Look at those highest performing teams and look at what is it that these particular high performing teams in those best performing companies are doing that tends to be having the strongest correlation to positive outcomes. I know that sounds like a lot of stuff, but there was quite a bit of work to get to that point where we can say, what are concrete behaviors that is related to positive outcomes? Now, the next slide will show you some of those results. Now, there were a couple of things that stood out. One was around something I would say is completely related to psychological safety. It had to do with the idea that titles were not important in how you could do your work, for instance, that you could speak up to your leader, those kind of things. The other was around emergent planning. But those are a little bit unrelated to our topic today, because this point here was the one that actually stood out the most. And when we looked at high-performing teams and compared them to average teams, we saw, well, one thing that surprised me was there wasn't that many differences overall. By and large, they did similar things, but a couple of things stood out, and that's what I'm going to try to point out here. What you see on the left-hand side, all of these are what's called Pearson correlation plots. They're basically a way to show correlations between certain behaviors in the team and positive outcomes as defined by these proxy variables that we used. Again, we're looking at speed to market, quality, and customer satisfaction. So we said, all right, looking at all that, where do we see differences in the behaviors between high-performing teams, which is on the left-hand side, and the rest, the average teams? And here were two that really stood out. Now, when you're looking at these little plots here, I know it's very hard to see this clearly, but the bluer and more oval the particular square circle is, the higher the correlation is. And what you're seeing in terms of the difference is what we call a contribution margin, which essentially is explaining the extent to which the team is performing differently from the rest. And two things really stood out here. Number one, and I think this one is super important, the team acts on retrospective feedback in a timely manner. The difference here, 2.4 times was the difference in contribution margin between high-performing teams and average teams. So that's telling you that not a causal relationship, but high-performing teams tend to do these types of behaviors more often and more consistently than average teams. So there's certainly a pattern here. And what I think is interesting about that statement is it acts on retrospective feedback in a timely manner. So it's not just that they do the retrospective, they also act on feedback from the retrospective, and they do it in a timely manner. So this is not something they do and they wait. They actually take action pretty quickly. The other part, which I think is much related to it, the team holds retrospective meetings at the end of each iteration in which the team evaluates how they're doing and discuss how to get better. This is what we call that sort of a traditional retrospective outcome, right? We expect that to happen. And that, of course, indeed was something that those high-performing teams were doing consistently as well. This is one of those things that Nikki was talking about, that dichotomy when it comes to retrospectives. You have some teams that do this and do it really well. And then retrospectives also are very often that ceremony that people say, well, this was just a bitching session. We just complained and then nothing happened. There are some teams that do that too, but I would submit that the difference is they don't actually take action on what's happening, and they don't do it in a timely manner, and they don't actually get any better. And that's a natural follow. If you don't do these things, if you don't actually get better at what you're doing, it's going to feel like a waste of time. And of course, then they're not going to be very effective. Underlying all of that, of course, is psychological safety. If you don't feel safe to talk about these things, if you don't feel like any of your feedback matters, well, it's probably not going to matter a lot, and you're probably not going to do those retrospectives. So I think that goes to the exactly things that Nikki was saying earlier. It's an extremely important and very powerful ceremony in Scrum and an essential element of Agile in general, but very difficult to do if you don't have the right conditions. And that's why these surveys that we're creating right now, ARIS, can help you say, what are the kind of things that need to be in place for this to work and to be effective? Let's do the next slide, and over to you, Nikki.
Yeah, so given these initial positive results and the possibilities for the future, of course, the need for the community in general to just have easy, engaging, and impactful retrospectives, I made it my mission to help spread what retrospectives can do, and not just the stories. I've heard a lot of those and they're great, but take it to the next level and try to figure out what makes an effective retrospective and to ultimately measure their outcomes. And so that's one of the things I'm very personally passionate about. And the team here at Retrium has kind of let me go and run with this and work with the team at Comparative Agility. And that's why I'm really excited to talk to you all about where we are today, because I really think there's an opportunity with the Aries assessment to fill this knowledge gap that we have in the community. So when I first came up with this crazy idea, I just started talking to people in the community, and Jorgen and I happened to connect, and it just made sense for us to work together. I had this idea to design a survey that would measure retrospective effectiveness, and they work with industry experts to administer and create these amazing surveys. So it's just a win-win opportunity, and I love that when we can create those possibilities out there in the community. So it was important for both of us to measure effective retrospectives with the goal of eventually quantifying their impact on business results. But additionally, it was really important to both of us too to make sure that the assessment was available for free, and that any results that we were able to generate would be things that we would give back to the community with white papers or making the data more accessible to everyone out there. So we were really on the same page from the beginning, and so we wanted to embark on this journey together. And so the first step, given that there's lots of possibilities, what's the smallest increment that we can do, it was to develop that pilot survey so that we could test it with folks in the community. So we wanted to assess all of the behaviors, attitudes, skills, processes, environmental conditions, all of the things that were indicative of a successful retrospective. So to do this, we did an extensive literature review, certainly looked at the things that I talked about earlier, but just looked out in the community in general and wanted to see, what's possible out there. So we pulled all of that information together and started to develop some survey questions that would measure all of those different things. We wanted an exhaustive list of everything that it took to make an effective retrospective. So that's really where we started. And then we had Esther Derby and Diana Larson. They're the co-authors of the first edition of Agile Retrospectives, Making Good Things Great. They're advisors here at Retrium as well. We had them take a look at the question list, give us some feedback, add and edit some things for content. And then we had some other folks trusted in our network as well to take a look at that and just give us some additional thoughts. So really took a lot of time to develop that initial pilot survey. And the initial alpha version of the survey that we tested had over 80 questions, so a lot. We tapped into everything from team dynamics and organizational culture to things like facilitator skills and individual perceptions of retrospectives, the facilitation process in the meeting itself, following up on action items after the retrospective to create that continuous improvement. So it was quite a list of things to say the least. So we want to take a look at the pilot sample number 1 here on the next slide. So we went out to the Agile community and we looked for people who had experience with retrospectives and ended up having 186 individuals participate in the first version of the survey. And that was late last year into early this year. So a big thanks to all of those people because it was a very long survey and we really got some great results from them. And so what you're looking at here is just some of the demographic characteristics because people are always interested in who participated in the survey. So 56% of the sample happened to have more than 5 years of experience with Agile, but others had less experience. So it was a good mix of folks from there. We also had a good mix of company sizes and company types, as you can see here. And while it wasn't a totally global sample, we did have participants from several European countries, the US, Australia, India, as well as a couple of participants from South American and African countries as well. So, a reasonable mix of folks that have experience in Agile, which is great. Also a mix of ages and titles. So it was a good distribution of folks. And the majority of our sample were software developers, scrum masters, project program managers, agile coaches as well, and some technical leaders. So, the people who would have most experience with retrospectives on a regular basis. So that was really the sample size that we worked with. And then what we did with the sample is we did something called a factor analysis with the questions. So I'm not going to go into all of the crazy math, but the idea behind a factor analysis is to try to figure out what questions hang together and which ones are most important. The purpose is to refine your measure and get it down to a smaller set of questions. It's a very common technique when you're building an assessment to try to figure out all of the possibilities, and then to mathematically refine those questions to the most important ones. So it's a process I used several times back in graduate school, and again, very common for surveys to be built in this way. And so the goal of the pilot was to refine the survey and get them to a lower set of questions, and we were able to do that as well. So if you go on to the next slide, what I'll talk about is how we refined those down to the things that were actually most important. So first of all, we removed all of the what we call reverse coded items, which are essentially negatively worded items where the rest of the survey was worded in a more positive way. And so you would take those questions and you'd end up reverse coding them because you'd expect the opposite of whatever the number is that they put in on an agreement type scale. We removed those questions. They're actually really great to make sure participants are paying attention when you have a super long survey, that's 80 questions. But ultimately, we didn't keep them because they just didn't hang well with the rest of the questions. That's actually not uncommon for this type of assessment. It kind of hurts people's brains when they do it a little bit. And so we wanted to keep everything positively worded. And so we did that going forward. And we did, if there was an idea we wanted to capture elsewhere, we kind of integrated that in a different question and just got rid of those reverse coded items to make sure that it was really straightforward, essentially going forward. And then we had a group of questions that were all about the team's facilitator. But we had a lot of issues with that particular set of questions. It did not hang well with everything else. There are so many different types of facilitators, so many different types of styles. Maybe the meeting rotates the facilitator all the time. It's a different person. And so those questions just didn't really fit with everything else. And that's not to say that the facilitator is not important. Obviously, the facilitator is very important and they're very impactful to retrospectives, but that's something that would need to be addressed separately outside of the context of this particular assessment. So we do, maybe someday we'll loop back in the future and look to create an assessment that would help retrospective facilitators specifically improve their skill set. That's an opportunity for another day. So we kind of set that piece to the side because those skills and behaviors are just a little bit different than everything else in the assessment. And we also ended up dropping some other questions, things that were really specific, like around reviewing objective and subjective data, for example, because that was actually just redundant with some of the other questions and didn't have this kind of impact that is important for each question to have when you're trying to refine a survey down. So although another thing we removed as well were things around fun. Oftentimes the facilitators are trying to amp up the retrospectives to make them fun, or they're changing the location of the meeting to try to mix things up. Those are great behaviors to do, but we actually didn't find on the survey itself that those things added much above and beyond the other questions that we had. So we ended up removing some of those things as well. And that led us to refine the survey down quite a lot, and ended up removing a couple other questions for clarity and got to 46 questions that we could test once again with another group of participants and another round of factor analyses. And that's a really important step because you don't want to just go with one. You want to go with a second sample to make sure that you can confirm the results that you found the first time around. So that's really what we chose to do. Very data-driven approach again to what we were doing. So if you want to go ahead to the next slide there, we'll talk about the second pilot sample that we worked with. So for the second round of testing, we had 326 responses with actually pretty similar demographics in the first group. Participants were from a range of companies, lots of different sizes, lots of different industries represented here, a little bit more than the first time around, not surprisingly with a larger sample size. And we had responses all over the globe, which is great, although there were concentrations in the US and Europe, but a little bit more of a global sample there. And then we had a mix of folks, again, from software teams this time around, a little bit more QA testers in this group, as well as executives and leaders in this mix as well. And again, similar, about 46% of this sample had 5 years of experience in Agile, so pretty similar to the first group. So that gives you just a sense of who's out there taking this assessment this time around. And after this round of factor analyses, we were able to remove just a couple other questions that just didn't quite mesh well in that second round assessment of the assessment, but it was really, really a good list of questions. And that left us with 44 questions across what ended up being 6 dimensions that I'm going to talk about here in a minute. So these are the 6 dimensions that make up an effective retrospective. So if you want to go ahead and move on to the next slide for me. Ta-da, here we are. These are the 6 dimensions that make up an effective retrospective. So first and foremost, constructing engaging meetings. These are things that are setting up the meeting in a particular way that encourage people to show up as their full self, and they make people want to actively participate in the meeting. So if you aren't putting together a meeting where people want to participate, you're probably not going to get good participation, probably not going to be particularly effective. So that one makes a lot of sense. Like Jorgen was mentioning earlier about psychological safety, the second dimension is building trust and psychological safety. If you don't have some behaviors that are helping to cultivate that feeling in others, then you're not going to have a particularly effective meeting. So people need to believe that the environment around the team is supporting individuals, and it's creating a space where people can really openly share their ideas, their questions, and their concerns. So that's the second dimension. The third is implementing a facilitation process. So sometimes retrospectives are just like open-ended conversations and we just kind of do whatever we want. That's not an effective retrospective. It's not having an open conversation. It's a well-structured meeting that happens on a regular basis that follows a particular flow that is recommended by experts, that has sort of an opening, a middle, and a closing to that. So that's an important part of creating an effective retrospective as well. And then the fourth dimension is cultivating organizational and team learning. So not only do we need to have a well-constructed meeting that's safe, that is facilitated, but it also needs to have some element of learning built into what we're doing. We're trying to learn together. And so the meetings need to be a place that creates a shared mental model of what's going well and what's not. And it's that opportunity to learn new things or valuable things that they can take forward, and that will help them be a better team together. So that's an important piece of this as well. And then we get to the fifth dimension, which is following through. Again, as Jorgen mentioned, you need to follow through to be successful with retrospectives. So you can't just have the meeting. You need to be doing something with that information after the meeting. So that's the fifth dimension here around following through, is taking what happens in the meeting and converting that into real next steps. Whether they're action items or they're experiments, it's something that you can do to move things forward. And then ultimately, there needs to be a sense that the meetings are enabling continuous improvement. So not only are you doing the meeting, but you're following through on that, and it should lead to change over time. So that's the enabling continuous improvement dimension, where we're demonstrating sustained results over time that are moving the teams forward to some type of desired outcome through that cycle of inspecting and adapting that they're creating here. And with that, I'll send it over to Jorgen to talk more about how these dimensions actually translate into a report that you can use to up-level your retros. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, these surveys are extremely important because they can give us an idea of how we work, and it can also give everyone a voice. I think very often it can be hard to truly articulate how we're doing because it could be people who may not be comfortable speaking up all the time. It could also be difficult to bring up topics, especially if psychological safety is not so high. These surveys kind of surface these things quicker for us. So what we always recommend you do is that we kind of use these as an invitation to our conversation. The idea here is to invite the team to take the survey, look at the results, and then examine those results by trying to find the narrative. And what we mean by that is that really looking for, is this a 3.4 score or is it a 4.8 score? The important thing isn't really the particular number. The important thing is the story behind the data. What is the story that the team is trying to tell you through their results? That's what we're trying to find out here. Once you have those stories, those narratives, the idea then is to work with the team through a facilitated process. And this is where a tool like Retrium, for instance, could be really useful to use these facilitation techniques to then find out what's actually going on, to not just look for the answers, but ask better questions. Find out what's behind all of this. Like, why do we feel this way? What surprised us about the results that we're seeing here? And as you're doing this, what's starting to happen is that you can actually create a common understanding in the team around the things that we do want to work on that is important for us, and then conduct experiments to say, well, why don't we try this next time? Or maybe we should adjust this little part here because it isn't really quite working for us. And then start to learn and then see how we can improve how we work over time. Not just trying to find the answer, but trying just to use that data as an input to making adjustments in our processes. At its essence, that's the essence of agility. If you think about it, it's all about being a little bit better today than we were yesterday. This data and this validated survey can help us know where to focus our efforts and try to be a little bit better today than we were yesterday. One thing that I like about Scrum in general is that Scrum doesn't give us answers. That's the idea with Scrum. It just helps us through these time boxes and through these quick iterations. It helps expose the dysfunction. It helps expose where we might want to focus our efforts next. And then it's up to us to actually do something about that information. This is information we wouldn't have known otherwise. Back in the day when I was doing traditional project management, I wouldn't know about the problems until we were about 95% done. That's when everything would blow up and it would become this huge train wreck. That's not what we do here in Agile. We try to encourage learning by having these fast feedback loops, by exposing the dysfunction before it becomes a real big problem so that we can do something about it. And that's exactly what this survey is doing. ARIS is trying to expose the dysfunction in our retrospectives so that we can take action on it and then experiment and learn and then continuously improve how we work. That's the whole idea of the survey. If you don't mind taking the next slide. What I'm showing you here is just some examples of some of those reports that you get when you take the survey. You can take it right now by going to retrospectivescale.com. I think it's out there. You'll see it on our site very quick here. You can take the survey right now. It's completely free. And as you take it, you will see results. And you will then start to look at the graphs and then use those graphs, use those insights that you get from those graphs to ask yourself better questions and to then improve how you work as a team. If you don't mind doing the next slide as well. What we're going to do then, because once we've done these things, this is going to help us collect a lot of data that's going to be really useful, just like Nikki was saying. Once we have this data, we can start to correlate this with business results. But then lots of other things can actually come out of this as well. And Nikki, you'll talk about some of the other things we're planning to do next with ARIS.
Yeah, absolutely. At this point, we have this well-validated measure for retrospective effectiveness, and that can be used for multiple purposes. Kind of the sky's the limit of what we can do with it, which is really exciting. And of course, there's value in just taking the assessment today, as Jorgen was saying, and because that's just powerful insights for you and your team to take forward and have conversations. And beyond the individual assessment that you can take now at retrospectivescale.com, we're also planning to add some additional things as we move forward, which I'm really excited about. So beyond the individual assessment, and using that information to continue to gather data and collect feedback from the community and refine the assessment. We're also planning to add some industry benchmarks, and you can help us do that. So once we have enough data, we'll be able to create those so that when people take the assessment, they'll be able to see how they fare against other people in the community. So that's really interesting to just see, okay, well, maybe we feel like we're not doing as well, but we're doing pretty well in comparison to the rest of the community. So that's kind of just something interesting to see and use as part of the conversation. Again, just an invitation to have a broader conversation and bring that back to the team. And then we also want to make the assessment available for teams to take. Right now, it's an individual assessment. You go, you take it, you bring it back to the team, which is great, and have those conversations. Everybody could take it separately and do that. But we also want to aggregate those results for teams and show that not only the individual perceptions, and of course, the industry benchmarks, but also all of that together with the team's aggregated results too, because this is going to give teams an even greater sense of where they can improve. Because the areas of disagreement and the areas of lower scores are opening up a whole different conversation, because you're seeing that across the team. And you can always, of course, double down on areas you're doing well and celebrate those wins too. So it's be really exciting for teams to do that, and we're really excited to dig into that step as well. And then the goal moving forward is to partner with other organizations out there to use the assessment along with measures of business outcomes, such as performance, employee engagement, innovation, productivity, much, much more, to look at that relationship between retrospectives and all of these other variables. So this is really just the beginning of what we can do now that we have this great assessment to take forward, and we're really excited to be able to do that. And ultimately, we want to write research papers on these topics and share this information with the whole community, because we really do have the goal of helping the community conduct effective retrospectives. So it's really exciting to take this forward. So we hope you're inspired to take action today and to work with your teams to take the assessment and up-level your retrospectives. So anyone who wants to do that, you're a great fit for the Aries. So we definitely invite you to take the assessment. So again, that's retrospectivescale.com if you want to take it. We're actually going to give everybody until the end of the day on October 1st to take the assessment. And you can then sign up for a coaching session with me. So you can take the assessment whenever, but that coaching opportunity is actually going to be something that we're offering this week. We're just going to give some people a little bit more time to take it. So if you watched our video earlier today, we're going to extend that offer to the end of the week so that we'll actually have 2 lucky winners who will win coaching with me. And what that means is if you take the Aries, you go back to retrospectivescale.com. You can sign up there to get that coaching opportunity. And what I'll do is use your Aries results to help you construct an engaging and safe retrospective next time around, one that's focused on learning and follow through, continuous improvement. We'll go deep in your results and just see what questions there are and areas and concerns that you have to really move things forward. So it's exciting opportunity to just see what questions someone from the outside might ask and spark things for your team internally. So that's really exciting. And you can see, again, it's retrospectivescale.com up here on the screen. We hope you enjoyed learning about the Aries today. And if anyone is interested in taking part in additional research, or you think your organization might be interested in partnering with us to take the Aries and maybe some other measures out there, we would love to connect with you. If you do take the assessment, if you implement changes from the Aries and you have results that you want to tell us about, please do that too. We'd love to hear those stories. We are just at the beginning here, so getting more feedback from you is always better. So we're very excited to do that. And if you do want to connect, my email is Nikki, N-I-K-I, @retrium.com. So I would love to connect with you on that. If you have any questions today, we are happy to open it up to the community today and answer any of those about the assessment or the process or anything else that might help you.
I would definitely take you up on a free coaching with Nikki. That is a unique opportunity, folks. I think her going rate's about $2,000 an hour. So if you have
Yeah,
this free coaching, I would
exactly.
definitely do that.
All right. Well, thank you everyone so much. We'll hang out here if anyone does have any additional questions or want to chat with us. But otherwise, that concludes our presentation. So we're so happy that you could join us today.
Thank you so much.